Welcome to Stream of Conscience. We're here today again with State Representative Jonathan Steinberg of Westport, State District 136. Jonathan's a Democrat, a first-term representative up in Hartford. And we're actually filming on Thursday morning, the 9th of June. And that's important because the session finished last night, as per the Constitution, at midnight.
That's correct.
And then there was a speech that the governor made after that. And then there might have been a few fond farewells at a party, and Jonathan probably hasn't gotten a whole lot of sleep, so I just want to make sure that everybody understands that he's here under duress this morning, and I appreciate your coming in.
Thank you, John, for that disclaimer on my bleariness this morning.
So I've asked Jonathan here to begin a series we're going to do on a retrospective of the first 6 months of the year in the state legislature, in the legislative session, Jonathan's first session. This session was different because for the first time in 20 years we had a party controlling both the governor's office and the legislature, both houses of the legislature. And so they knew that if they passed a bill that the governor liked, it was going to get signed. And that actually changes the dynamics of what gets passed, because no longer can the state legislature pass a bill to appeal to their base, knowing that the governor was going to veto it and they couldn't overturn it. So that actually changes things quite a bit. And so Jonathan is here. I've asked him to think about what were the three most important bills, in his opinion, that have gone through this year and why he voted either for them or against them. So Jonathan, let's take it away. What was the most important thing that happened this year?
The governor made that very clear in his remarks last night at midnight, alluding to the many accomplishments we made as a legislature this year. He said, but it was all about the budget, first and foremost. And I think he was absolutely correct on that. The order of magnitude of our deficit, $3.5 billion, which because of late arriving revenue changes and projections ended up being closer to $3 billion, really drove the train. But it was more than that. It was also an opportunity for this governor to demonstrate his leadership style, which was very bold, very aggressive. I think that we all expected a change in the dynamic, as you described, between the legislature and the governor's office, with a Democrat in the governor's office. But I don't think anybody in leadership anticipated just how assertive the governor and his people would be in setting the agenda and pushing for the things they felt were priorities.
So you said bold and aggressive. Let's talk about each of those. How was he bold?
I think he was very smart coming right out of the chute with not merely a budget, but a message about what his priorities were. He was clear from the start. It was about education and jobs and preserving the safety net, and yet putting the state on a much more responsible and transparent track in terms of its fiscal accountability. And he was consistent in that message throughout. I give him credit for his 17-town town hall tour, where he really listened. I think some of the adjustments that were made to the budget were in response to what he heard from people. So he was both very consistent and assertive in what he wanted to accomplish, but he also was willing to compromise in many ways, as we saw.
So you also talked about assertive, and when the budget came down to the House, you voted against it.
Yes, it was a very hard decision for me because, again, I admire what the governor has tried to accomplish. As I've mentioned before, I'm a member of the moderates caucus within the Democratic caucus, a number of us who may be socially fairly progressive, but when it comes to fiscal matters, really want to see if there are ways in which we can reform government, make it more efficient. And of the, I think, 15 dissenting votes from the Democratic side when the budget came up for a vote, I think a dozen of us were from the moderates caucus. We had had conversations with leadership and with the governor's office about trying to not have as many sales tax increases and seeking additional savings that we had identified on a laundry list that we had sent. Unfortunately, we never anticipated that there would be a budget deal as quickly as came about. So by the time we were in dialogue with leadership, they had already really cut a deal with the governor. So when I saw the $2 billion sort of IOU, which was the governor's promise in terms of savings with the state workers, I had a concern. I wasn't comfortable not knowing how or if he was going to be able to accomplish what many felt to be a humongous number, 20% of the entire cost of state workers' compensation.
Right. So you voted against it, and as you had feared, the $2 billion didn't materialize in the governor's negotiations with the unions. They came up with a package which the governor has valued at $1.6 billion over 2 years, pretty much equally split between the first year and the second year. Other people think that a lot of those numbers are soft, but it still left a $400 million hole at a minimum that needed to be covered, and they had to come back and make some adjustments. So what were those adjustments, and how did you vote on those things?
First, let me say that the Democratic caucus met and we urged our leadership to make sure that the governor would be obliged to come back to us should he fail to obtain the full $2 billion, and that was our understanding. None of us were surprised that he had difficulty getting the full $2 billion. As you've mentioned, both members of the Republican Party and also the media have noted that there are some very soft numbers in the assumptions. There are certain hopes to save a lot of money through changes in the health care program. There are those who have said that it'll take several years for those to obtain. They may not see them in a timely fashion. There was $180 million in there for savings from suggestions from workers, which may be a bit of a bold number. During the negotiation period, I was initially very encouraged that the governor had said that any surpluses that they might project would be used to pay down the state's debt, which is as much, if not a greater problem, as our short-term operating deficit.
We have one of the highest per capita debts in the entire country.
It's remarkable. It's $46,000 per capita, and it's under any normal circumstances, it will take us decades to pay off. But I give the governor credit for putting us on a responsible path, and we're going to be shifting to GAAP principles, GAAP principles that will make our real obligation more apparent.
I should point out, when you say it'll take decades to pay off, it's intended to take decades to pay off.
That's a fair point.
That, bonding is usually done in a 20 or a 30-year horizon. So while it's a large number, it's not something that's a looming disaster. It's a large number. I don't want to downplay the fact that it is a large number.
I wish it was all bonding. However, a lot of it has to do with our pension obligations, which we should have been paying into for many years. And to catch up, if you will, can't be done that quickly without putting great strains on the budget.
So they came up with a plan to cover the $400 million. What was it, and how did you react to that?
Many of us were hoping that that would be based upon additional savings that he would find. He had put together, as you know, a Plan B list, which scared a lot of people.
Which we talked about.
Right. Obviously, it could have affected municipalities who had already passed their budgets. The safety net was very much at risk. There may have still been some more opportunity for cuts there without necessarily having a huge impact on either the economy or the safety net. But instead, the governor chose to use the projected surpluses to cover the majority of the $400 million, with a slight adjustment, $80 million being slight, to the medical claim projection based upon experience in the current year, which is always a bit risky as well.
So while he did not raise taxes further, which he had promised to do, he said that the tax increases that were built into the original budget, that's where they stood. He had said that he was going to get $2 billion from the state workers. He got, on paper, 1.6. We'll see how that plays out. And then in order to make up the gap, they said, well, revenues are actually running ahead of where we were projecting even a few months ago. So we'll take that and we'll use it to cover this hole, and with another minor adjustment along the way.
And that was one of the reasons why, in the past few days, I also voted against the implementer bill. For those who are not familiar, there are a number of bills that follow the budget, which get into the specifics. I voted for all the other implementers because there were some very good things, but this one, to a large degree, because of the $400 million, I could not support. Additionally, once again, funds that were coming out of the gas tax were being diverted to the general fund and not to the transportation fund. And we in Fairfield County feel very strongly about making sure we fully fund transportation given our needs.
Absolutely. And before we leave the budget, we should point out that the union deal that was worked out needs to be approved by how many different bargaining units?
There are 15 units, but it's a little complicated. There are large units and small units. 13 out of the 15 need to approve, and then I think that all three need to approve different aspects of the pact.
And that voting is just beginning.
Yes.
And if you read the blogs, there's significant resistance amongst the unions. We don't know, how much of that is hot air and how much of it represents real unhappiness. And so I think what we can say for certain at this moment is that there isn't any certainty about the vote.
I wouldn't read too much into bloggers. Oftentimes you find the more extreme elements. I've seen comments on both sides of the fence. The general consensus, at least the buzz I've heard in Hartford, is it's a pretty good deal for the unions, and they'd be very foolish not to accept the deal, particularly if the governor is serious about massive layoffs in the event that they don't ratify it.
And the first time that he talked about this a month or so ago, he was talking about 4,700 layoffs.
4,500, 4,700.
Somewhere in that neighborhood. He's now saying that if the unions don't pass the deal, the number will be north of 7,000.
I'd heard 7,500.
I had to. Yeah. So the point here is that, this comes back, I think, to your comment about aggressiveness. The governor is certainly out there and pushing the unions very hard to approve this deal. And I think the message to them from him is that this is the best deal you're going to get, and if you don't take it, it's going to be it's going to be a very difficult situation going forward.
I would advise the unions to take him at his word.
Right. So, all right, let's leave the budget, as fascinating as the budget has been.
Well, we're going to be living with it for a while.
We're going to be living with it, and you may actually have to come back and do some more legislating around it, especially if the unions decide not to approve it.
I'm glad you mentioned that. The governor said something last night that I found very interesting. He's going to ask us to come back in special session in the fall, which is not a usual practice. To discuss jobs, because that's the other thing that to some degree has been lost in the sauce. One of the other bills we'll discuss was certainly putatively about jobs, but it's very important to him, and I'm really pleased that he is asking us to come together again, and we may have a sort of reprise on the budget even as we discuss jobs in the fall.
Well, and of course then there's next year where you have a session which is actually designed to look at the budget midway through and see if changes need to be made. So
some of us are hoping the economy will have improved sufficiently to look at sunsetting some of those taxes.
All of us are hoping that the
unlikely,
economy will
but
improve. Yes. So what's second up on your list of most important bills for this session?
Probably the second most important bill would be the energy bill that we passed in the past week.
Okay.
For
Hasn't
anybody,
gotten a lot of press.
I think it kind of got lost in the sauce with all the other issues going on. And that's unfortunate. The only remarks I've made during the entire session were in support of this bill. And I opened by saying that I feel it's landmark legislation.
Okay.
It is both far-ranging and of import. Probably the most prominent element within the energy bill, and it's a very extensive bill. It took many months to negotiate, and it was a real example of bipartisanship and also collaboration between the Senate and the legislature.
Were you part of the committees that worked on
I
the bill?
was not. I'm not sufficiently senior, but I did have a role with some of the sections in the bill having to do with green jobs creation. But the most prominent feature is the creation of what we are now calling DEEP. And as I like to joke, we're all in deep at this point. And that's going to be the new combined Department of Energy and Environmental Protection.
So DEEP.
Right.
Right. Okay.
As Dan Esty, the new commissioner
of
DEEP, likes to call it, he'd really prefer to call it DEEP to include the economy in it as well, which shows that he's consistent with the mayor and with Catherine Smith in economic and community development, that jobs and the economy are very much part and parcel of everything we do as we go forward.
Right.
So creation of this new entity, which is certainly not free of controversy, it cedes a measure of authority from the legislature to the administration in this regard.
How is that?
Because up until now, the legislature was the de facto policymaker in energy. we didn't have an energy policy function within the administration and haven't had for many years.
That's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary, and I don't think it was particularly well balanced. We're looking forward to an effective partnership going forward, but it meant that we were certainly not as nimble as we needed to be.
Right.
If you're doing everything through regulation and statute, you really can't react to innovation and efficiency that's being present in the marketplace.
So the new DEEP was number 2 on your list, and we'll be seeing, I'm sure, a lot of changes.
There are many things in that bill we could go on and on. The piece that I was involved with, we're going to try to start doing energy efficiency initiatives with state buildings. We've empowered municipalities to look at energy efficiency measures.
Good.
And hopefully down the road we'll be talking about residential and commercial opportunities as well. There's really so much in the bill which really changes the entire structure of how we buy power, and we're going to be much more nimble in terms of using spot markets versus laddered long-term contracts. It gets a little bit dense, but there's some important stuff in there.
Right. So, number 3 on your list.
Probably the most controversial bill in the session. May have been more hype than reality, but certainly everybody has been talking about paid sick leave since the beginning of the session, if not before.
Yep, and it was also one of those things that the governor said from day one that he was a strong supporter of. I know that there was a lot of activity throughout the session on behalf of paid sick leave.
I was lobbied heavily, as I'm sure almost all my colleagues were, by both sides. And from very early on, there was some dispute as to fact, and the bill itself changed significantly, particularly when it got to the Senate and some amendments were placed on. They reduced its scope, but at the end it became rather frenzied, I think is probably the right word. We were being deluged with phone calls and emails, many of them encouraged by CBIA, the business lobby. Very bright people, but very aggressive lobbyists in this regard. They really.
So the governor's not the only aggressive force.
No, as a freshman legislator, I've learned that there are a number of aggressive forces there with a lot more experience than a freshman has. So part of my job was to separate the fact from the spin, if you will.
Okay.
And they really made this kind of their big issue for the year. They really painted it as a job killer. In fact, that's the way. If we talked about the transgender rights bill as the bathroom bill, this was a job killer bill, and it made it very hard for me. The last thing I wanted to do was anything that was going to discourage jobs in the state.
But you voted for this bill.
I did vote for it. I felt it was a public health issue and a common sense issue.
What does the bill actually do at the end of the day?
Well, first of all, it's focused really, I wouldn't call it a pilot program, but it's not involving all workers in the state. It's only dealing with service workers. It exempts those in manufacturing and certain other categories, and it only affects businesses with 50 employees or more. The gist of what the bill hopes to accomplish is to keep people who are ill from having to come into work and spread those germs. But what you need to be able to provide them in return is pay so that they can stay home or take care of their kids who are ill and the like. And many companies already provide some version of this, either in association with their vacation time. But oftentimes the legislature steps in because there are bad actors who are not doing the basic things. And it just seems like it's a common sense thing to offer people in the state of Connecticut.
I think so as well, and I was a big supporter of it myself. So it's been a very, very busy session. A lot got done, and I'm sure we're going to be hearing more about that going forward. I wanted to spend a couple of minutes here talking about an issue that actually looks forward to the next election. And the reason why we're doing that is because we had the census last year. We have reapportionment this year. It's constitutionally required. Every 10 years, we look to see where people are living now, and then we adjust the districts in the state. So, for example, at the congressional level, while Connecticut didn't lose any seats or gain any seats, its population kept up enough with the U.S. to maintain the 5 congressional seats. It's possible that there'll be some shifts as to where people are living in the state, and there might be some redrawing of those boundaries. Likewise, in the House and in the State House and the State Senate, there's always the urge to change boundaries, often to protect incumbents on both sides. And in this state, because there's a bipartisan group of legislators set up to do this, and the final bill has to be approved by 2/3 of both houses. It's basically the Republicans and the Democrats. Even the Republicans are vastly outgunned. They've got enough strength in both houses so that they can't be ridden roughshod over, and so there'll be some bipartisan deal that's done. All of that prologue is to say, how are you doing in all of this? What do you see as happening with redistricting in your district or around the state?
Well, certainly I feel fortunate in that I've been representing just one town, and the town I grew up in, and I feel very comfortable representing. And I'm fortunate in that sense because many of my colleagues represent 2, 3, 4 towns, which is very complicated.
Yes.
So my number one objective would be to stay as a Westport representative.
Now, I've actually heard, sorry to interrupt, but I've actually heard that with the campaign finance law being as it is, and having more than one town in your district is a plus because it more easily enables you to raise the money that you need to qualify for public financing. So whilst I would agree with you that it would be best to represent one town if it's possible, or make sure that your district didn't overlap too many towns, I think there may be some push in the legislature this year to give people pieces of towns in order to make their fundraising easier. Have you heard anything like that?
I have not. It doesn't excite me, that prospect, because I've spoken to a number of my colleagues who complain of having to go to 4 DTC meetings and 4 parades.
Democratic town committees.
Right. So that it cuts both ways, I suppose.
Sure.
And one could argue, depending upon your campaign strategy, it can cost you a lot more for media if you're dealing with more towns rather than fewer.
Certainly at the state rep level where you're going to be doing newspaper advertising, that could be a problem. You're right. Well, we'll see how it works out. I mean, right now you represent most but not all of Westport.
About 80%.
80% of Westport. That's done pretty strictly on a population basis. So it's unlikely that they're going to give you all of Westport, and it's unlikely that they're going to give you much of anything else. So you'll probably stay, I think, pretty much where you are.
Obviously, there are going to be some shifts that will take place. As you mentioned, there have been some population shifts.
Right.
The eastern half of the state has seen the greatest growth, but on a lower base.
Right.
But you're right. Every district has to have roughly the same population.
Right.
Westport's been relatively stable compared to the rest of the state.
Right.
There are other considerations in play. Certainly, the needs of my district may become subsidiary to the needs to move some other districts around.
Right.
So the only thing I've asked of our leadership is to keep it as close to what I've got as possible.
Wow. So, Jonathan, thank you very much for coming in again.
My pleasure.
On such short sleep. Go home, get a nap, and...
I'll have to watch your screening of this to find out what I said.
It's good. Thank you very much. So this has been a Stream of Conscience. My guest today, Jonathan Steinberg, the state rep from District 136 in Westport. And now here's Ann Galloway with our Stream of Conscience book review for this week, Death of the Liberal Class by Chris Hedges.
Chris Hedges was for many years a foreign correspondent and Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. And in 2002, he was part of a team of reporters awarded the Pulitzer Prize for the paper's coverage of global terrorism. Now he's a senior fellow at the Nation Institute, and he also writes a weekly column for Truthdig. In 2003, while still at the Times, he delivered a commencement address at Rockford College in Illinois, in which he said about Iraq, "We are embarking on an occupation that, if history is any guide, will be as damaging to our souls as it will be to our prestige and power and security." This caused such an uproar that the address was cut short and security officials had to escort him off campus. The Wall Street Journal criticized his anti-war stance, and the Times reprimanded him for making remarks that could undermine the paper's impartiality. George Orwell once said, "A genuinely unfashionable opinion is almost never given a fair hearing, either in the popular press or in the highbrow periodicals." And in Death of the Liberal Class, Hedges shows how this has remained true to our day. He writes, liberals, socialists, trade unionists, independent journalists, and intellectuals, many of whom were once important voices in our society, have been banished or muzzled by corporate control throughout academia, culture, the media, and government. Hedges contends that permanent war is used by the power elite to stifle reform and muzzle dissent, and the liberal class is rendered impotent. Corporations have taken over our internal security and intelligence apparatus, now run our economy and control its systems of communication, have built a privatized military, and essentially own the two major political parties. Hedges calls the current state of this country inverted totalitarianism, where corporate power purports to honor electoral politics, freedom, and the Constitution. But these corporate forces so corrupt and manipulate power as to make democracy impossible. His conclusion: there is no national institution left that can accurately be described as democratic. This book was difficult and depressing to read. But my undergraduate major was in modern European history with emphasis on Germany. And when Hedges draws attention to parallels with the Weimar Republic and its descent into fascism, I see that too. In our greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression, the government bailed out some of those most responsible for this mess, but hasn't prosecuted the worst offenders. Tax cuts for the wealthy and powerful were retained, while talk about shared sacrifice has come to mean that essential services and protections for everyone else are targeted. States and municipalities are being threatened with bankruptcies. Infrastructure repairs can't be afforded. Education is threatened. Workers in the public sector may lose their pensions. And the rule of law? Conservative Supreme Court justices no longer even pretend to fairness, voting to declare that corporations are people. The president, whom we hoped would return the country to a rule of law, has replaced substance with theater, given the continuing state of war, waged primarily by unsupervised mercenaries and drone attacks that kill innocent women and children. Might the Nobel Committee wish it could rescind the prize it awarded on the basis of change we can believe in? What we were raised to believe now has become an illusion. And the liberal class that once fought on the people's side has largely been co-opted. It may be too late to save our grand experiment with democracy. This has been a Stream of Conscious book review. I'm Ann Galloway. Thanks for watching.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. If you live in the town served by Cablevision from Norwalk, you can catch our show every Wednesday evening, 6:30 p.m. through June, and beginning in July, the new time, at 8 p.m. If you're interested in learning more about progressive political action in Fairfield County, please check out our group, Democracy for America. We meet the first Wednesday of every month at the Silver Star Diner in Norwalk from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m., and we're always looking for new members.